Good afternoon. I'm Earl Lewis, the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy, and the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our Juneteenth event, 20 Things Everyone Should Know About Slavery. Juneteenth is important because it represents the day in June of 1865 when word of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Galveston, Texas. That action, followed by ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, resulted in the legal termination of slavery in the United States. This was nearly 250 years after the first 20 Africans were sold into bondage in colonial Virginia in 1619. Remembering Juneteenth is a way to punctuate the importance of freedom and to recall that men, women, and children endured the hazards of slavery for generations. Their labor produced wealth and security for others, even as it brought them pain, suffering, and moments of despair. But Juneteenth symbolizes something more. It speaks to the long pursuit of freedom and justice. And it serves to remind us that just as our forebears knew, change just does not come. It must be designed, crafted, implemented, and enacted. That is the takeaway from yesterday's historic legislation, making Juneteenth a federal holiday. We applaud all who understood the need to become the architects of the change we so desperately seek. On this day and every day, I invite you to dedicate your lives to becoming change makers for the betterment of all. It is with a nod toward change that we present today's program. It grew out of a conversation among scholars, activists, civic leaders, and others in November of 2016. At a gathering at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, those assembled imagined a time when we could discuss slavery and its aftermath in American life in multiple public venues. It was sparked by many events, but one event in particular stood out. During the summer of 2016, a confrontation between a Black woman and a white man on an L train from Brooklyn to Manhattan. The most democratic of all acts played out by the minute in New York City is competition for the first backside on a subway car seat. That day, the Black woman prevailed. Rather than shrugging and letting it go, the white man challenged and berated the Black woman for taking his seat. She engaged him in a verbal exchange, during which he came to profess his allegiance for then candidate Donald Trump. Thus, an otherwise innocent encounter mushroomed into a form of political theater. Before it was over, the man told the woman, once Trump became president, he was going to send her and her kind back to the blankly fields. That comment was wrong on so many levels, least of which is that the political economy of agricultural slavery had collapsed long before then and had been replaced by the industrial age, which had given way to the post-industrial age, and then the digital age, and now the knowledge economy. Nonetheless, with no pun intended, modern confrontations over competition, expectations, desired outcomes, and more can quickly give way to the ostensibly most important trump card of all. Some enslaved and others were enslaved. Tracing your lineage supposedly locates you on the social spectrum and situates your overall worth. At least that was the logic behind the man's retort. As a result of such encounters, the assembled group thought, what if we could craft a rotating list of the 20 things, facts, ideas, etc., that all should know about slavery and its aftermath? Today, my colleagues from around the country and world will attempt to do that very thing. They will talk among themselves for about 75 minutes, during which time they will field questions posed by you. Toward the end of the program, we want to shift to current actions. At the Center for Social Solutions, we have several projects underway among them projects on and about reparations. One is the preparation of a reparations index, aided by significant help from our friends at Candid, which did a nice job too of helping to promote this event. The second is a 3-year effort funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to secure just futures through community-based reparations initiatives. My new colleague, Dr. Jessica Cruz, will tell you more about those efforts before we conclude. We'd like to thank our panelists and their institutions, as well as our university co-sponsors who helped us spread the word and graciously promoted this event. The University of Michigan's Law School's Human Trafficking Clinic, the University of Michigan's Rackham Graduate School, the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, the university's Poverty Solutions, and the University of Michigan's Literature, Sciences, and the Arts College Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And then a very special shout out to all of you who shared word of this event with your networks. This afternoon's program will be moderated and led by Dr. Daina Ramey Berry, the Oliver H. Radkey Regents Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at the University of Texas at Austin. The first person of color to hold that role, she is a prize-winning historian and a noted scholar of slavery. She is joined by an esteemed group of colleagues that she will introduce shortly. Finally, the facts to be discussed today are meant to be provocative and to unsettle assumptions. They aim to initiate a critical discussion among the public about the interplay between past and present forms of human slavery or involuntary servitude. For example, for many in the United States, 2019 marked the 400th anniversary of the importation of the first African peoples into colonial British North America and the start of the system of bonded labor we know as chattel slavery. Slavery as a system of social and labor relations is far older, however, and its effects on contemporary life worldwide are more pervasive and enduring than is commonly understood. While the United States banned slavery in 1865 with passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, slavery has not ended in the United States or in the world. Across the globe, an estimated 27 to 40 million persons are held against their will for profit and gain. This Juneteenth event aims to illuminate the past and to tie the past to aspects of the present. Before turning the program over to Professor Berry, we want to air a brief video of the 20 things you should know. Again, welcome and thank you for participating in our Juneteenth program.
afternoon. Welcome. I'm going to just give you a little bit of the run of the show of how we're going to function from here forward as I'm moderating. We're going to first, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists, and afterwards we're going to have a discussion of both contemporary and historical forms of enslavement and captivity. After that, if you have questions, you can text them into the Q&A function. And we have colleagues that will be behind the scenes keeping track of all the questions. I will ask as many as we can, and what we don't come up with today, if we don't get to them all today, we will be posting them on Twitter through the Center for Social Solutions website. So please make sure you follow the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan so that you can make sure that we have responded to your questions that were posed today. Now, up next, I'm going to introduce our panelists, but first I have a question that I want us to think about to guide our discussion today, in addition to our conversation about the facts. One of the questions we're going to look at is, why are we linking historical and contemporary slavery in this conversation? And we're going to talk about that as a group when I call on my panelists. One of our first speakers is David Blight. David W. Blight is a teacher and scholar and public historian at Yale University. He is a Sterling Professor of History, joining that faculty in 2003. And in June of 2004, he began serving as the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Welcome, David. Our next panelist is Ambassador retired Louis C. DeVaca, who is a senior fellow in modern slavery at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University, and a visiting lecturer in law at the Yale University Law School. He also focuses where he teaches on the history of human trafficking, modern slavery, and the 13th Amendment. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks, Dan.
Sure. Our next guest is Duncan Jepson. He is the founding and managing director of Liberty Shared, a leading global anti-trafficking NGO working on counter-modern slavery and anti-wildlife trafficking. Welcome, Duncan. Our next guest is Genevieve LeBaron, who is a professor of politics and director of the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Sheffield. She is an internationally renowned expert on modern slavery, known for her research on the business dynamics of modern slavery in global supply chains. Welcome, Genevieve. Our next and final, but not last but not least, is Professor James Alexander Robinson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies with an emphasis in Black Studies at the Metropolitan State University and curator of the Third Slavery Archive for the Center for Social Solutions. Welcome, James.
Thank you.
So we're going to begin our discussion today talking about some of the facts, and I would love to hear from each one of you about some of the facts that really touched you or struck a chord with you. And I'd like to start off with David Blight. Would you like to say a few things about the facts?
Sure, thanks, Dinah. Well, one of the facts is number 14 about the 3/5 clause is my assignment. And it states that the 3/5 clause got into the Constitution as a means of the Southern states gaining extra power, indeed political power, voting power. That's true. The 3/5 clause was, of course, a compromise without which, it's one of the compromises without which probably the Constitution couldn't have been achieved and Southern support attained. But here are some of the facts. There were approximately 700,000 slaves in the United States in 1790 when this was implemented. 2/5 of them, because of the 3/5 clause, were not counted for purposes of representation and direct taxation. There wasn't a lot of direct taxation then, but that was part of the deal. That meant that 280,000 of those American slaves were not counted, but 3/5 of them were, and it gave the Southern states, the slave states, additional representation in Congress, additional power in the Electoral College, and by many accounts, this is still a little bit debated, but by many accounts, probably helped Thomas Jefferson win the presidency in the year 1800 in his famous encounter with John Adams. it should also be known that there were northern states, particularly New England states, who hated the 3/5 clause, or delegates to the Constitutional Convention who hated it, did not want it. But it was part of the deal making that the checks and balances system of the US Constitution, out of which it was created. So that 3/5 clause was from the very beginning a problem in how African Americans, enslaved or otherwise, free, were viewed, were assessed as human beings in this country. It is one of those elements of the Constitution that made it deeply complicitous with slavery, even though abolitionists later, some of them, will also find anti-slavery elements in the Constitution and set up that momentous debate that would lead to the American Civil War.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Duncan next, and we'll come back to you, David. I think we have some others that we're going to talk about.
Sure.
One of the first facts that we have is under institutional law, slavery is a crime. Can you talk a little bit about that with us, Duncan?
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I mean, that fact, I think, is there because in a very short and sweet statement, we say something that I think lawyers, historians will want to debate for days. But the point is, ultimately, is that for those who aren't academics and human rights lawyers, it feels like this is where we should have got to in the 21st century. And unfortunately, when we look back, we asked, first of all, the question, well, if it is a crime, and I think, even just a review of statutes and so forth, you would say that initially the idea of slavery is a crime, then who has been held accountable? Where are all the perpetrators? Where are those people who should be held liable? And where are all the damages that would have come from those perpetrators' actions? And that simply isn't available to be seen because it hasn't really happened. And so it's a fact that at law, in most jurisdictions, to own somebody, to use them to create wealth, to put them on your balance sheet, as happened pre-Civil War, to breed human beings, to sell them and to make income, those things are abolished and are crimes. But to run a business where you can still use a person to create income, which is also what happened pre-1965, this is still happening. And so if those people on here, particularly who are attendant to in business, when you think of slavery, think of it generally as how do you get labor onto your balance sheet and how do you get labor into your income stream? As an accounting, as an asset, as a chattel, that is a crime and was abolished, but as a means of making income, that is still present. And either way, there are very, very few people who've ever been held accountable for this. And that seems very dissonant. So I think the fact is good to go up first because it raises the question that all is not what it seems in the subject. And anybody who is thinking about this should not simply accept any fact for what it is, but needs to look deeply in what is happening today, but what happened in history.
You raised an issue that I brought up at the beginning about this question. And before we go on to some of the other facts, we're talking about both the past and the current state of life, right? We're talking about the past and the present. And I wanted to hear just if you want to say a little bit more about that, and maybe some of the other panelists can weigh in about why we decided to have this discussion of both historical and contemporary facts related to slavery and human trafficking.
So, I mean, just briefly in response there is that I would say that I'm not from the US, but after the Civil War, you have this period where businesses are trying to stay profitable, but can no longer have human beings on their balance sheet and in their sort of make income from the sale of human beings. So they're struggling in the South to be profitable or to be viable, of which most fail. And so they think of other ways to coerce labor. And at that point, you then start to have some of the practices that we see today of abuse in various ways. And let's not forget that, the largest empire at that time, the British Empire, although, much has been made of its abolition of slavery in the 19th century, indentured servitude continued in the British Empire as part of the industrial complex of the British Empire up until 1920. And so this is not a simple case of saying, oh, at this date, 1807 or 18 something, we did this. This continues now, and these practices are very much part of modern management practices, and we shouldn't forget that.
Thank you. Lou, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the lens that our host, Earl Lewis, has framed this with, I think is actually quite a good one as we think about that kind of overarching question, Dinah. The idea of there being kind of a third slavery that we find ourselves in these days. There's kind of ancient slaveries and the social systems, especially the classics that are out there, Greece and Rome, and of course they then influenced modern slaveries. The second slavery very much being tied to the British colonial and European colonial expansion, especially into the New World. And so much over the last 50 years, I think, has been reframing things for scholars outside of simply the kind of US Civil War experience or the US abolitionist experience, which is a very comfortable way of saying that it ended in 1865 and none of us have to do anything about it. For all of us in the Latino community, for folks in the Native American community, and for folks in the Black community, that just doesn't necessarily jibe with what people actually experienced, even after it became illegal. We don't pass a law against murder and then say that there is no more murder. We then end up going and investigating and hopefully bringing accountability when people still do it. And hopefully we put things in place as far as anti-violence and other things so that we can do away with the underlying things that drive us to war. So this idea of the third slavery being kind of the post-emancipation slaveries that resist. And I'll do it so that I can jump David, and I'll quote Frederick Douglass first on this panel. It was literally less than 3 weeks after the guns had fallen silent that Douglass had to stand up at the abolitionist meeting and say, we can't disband, we can't say that we just won, because that old snake is simply going to shed its skin and call itself something new. And I think that that's what we talk about when we talk about the third slavery. That's what we talk about when we're saying that, the Supreme Court's decision yesterday, and as far as the applicability of American extraterritorial law in the Ivory Coast, as far as cocoa plantations are concerned. For my classes at law school, I'm going to end up having to figure out, how do I teach that and Dred Scott together, because they are the slavery jurisprudence of this country.
David?
Well, I'm not going to quote Douglas, Lou. I think it's Kierkegaard who said, live life looking forward. We understand it only looking backward. Past and present, hand in glove. That sounds like a cliche, but sometimes we're reminded of it by the shock of recognition, as we have in the past year, perhaps. Human exploitation is as old as human societies. It's changed over time. It may always exist, but the worst thing we can do is think we can just live above history in the present, because it will come back around and whack you between the eyes.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to comment on the historical versus contemporary before we move back on to the facts? Okay, so we're going to go on to fact number 3. We're going to jump ahead here. The majority of human trafficking victims are, in fact, adults. Duncan, do you want to say something about that?
So you've got me again.
Yes.
So I think, again, as I came from a business background of finance and supply chains before that, at the end of the day, labor is a resource and it's an asset. And the question for people in the most brutal sense of running a business is, what technologies do you use to get the most from your assets? And pre-65, and as we've said, but it is as a chattel, as an asset on the balance sheet and through income. That has obviously changed, but at the brutality of it is that obviously adults are going to provide more income from their labor than children. In the last 20 years, or last 15 years, through human trafficking and child labor, there's obviously been a lot more awareness on child labor, and children are certainly used where they can, you can see them being more profitable than, or they're more available than adults. But again, going back to the point that David and Lou made, is that history still stands. This is about adults, and it is about their labor and turning that into income. And we shouldn't forget that at all, that not much has truly changed. And we need to be aware of that. So the final point I'd make is that the people who are happy to engage in this, they are going to innovate that technology as much as anybody innovates any other technology. And the reason the law is always behind is because in everything else, certainly as somebody who was a corporate lawyer, the law is always going to be behind because people are going to innovate quickly. And so, yeah, as David just said, is that, and you said this will be something that will keep happening. Just because we have legislation against murder is not going to stop happening either. So I'll finish at that point.
Thank you. So Genevieve, I want to talk to you about fact number 4. A recent estimate suggests approximately 40 million people live in compelled service worldwide in forced labor, sex trafficking, and forced marriage situations. Can you say a few things about that one?
Sure, I'd love to, Daina. I mean, almost bridging back in some ways to the earlier conversation about history, I think one of the things that strikes me about these facts as a contemporary scholar of forced labor is that there are more facts about the history of slavery, and especially about the business dynamics of that slavery, than there are about forced labor today. And I think, one of the key reasons for this is that it's very difficult to study forced labor in the economy today. For many different reasons. It's illegal. Companies and governments don't want you to have access to their workforces, et cetera. So fact 4, which is the latest estimate of the number of workers in the global economy subjected to forced labor, sex trafficking, and forced marriage. It's our best and most rigorous estimate, but it's still in many ways, I think, just a guess. And it's important to note that, many researchers think this number could be much, much larger than it is. It's also important to note that the number keeps changing over time because the way that it's being calculated keeps changing, because we're still developing the methods and the ability to be able to accurately and kind of rigorously and comparatively estimate this. And so I think, this is an area where it's important to have that number. That number has done a lot to raise awareness of the scale of this problem and how it's continued. But we also can't put all of our faith in it because it's still very early days in some ways in terms of researching these problems.
Thank you. So true. So James, fact 5, slavery is not addressed in most traditional economic texts. Can you say a few things about that? And for those that are watching, we have the facts that are they're in the chat, and please start filling us with questions in the Q&A box. So we'll be getting to the questions in about 20 minutes.
Thank you, Daina. There was a question in the chat and the Q&A actually that is kind of related to this fact. Slavery is not addressed in most traditional economic textbooks. One of the tasks that I had when I was working with the Center for Social Solutions is compiling a up-to-date bibliography of slavery, both in its historical as well as in contemporary forms. And I thought, wow, slavery is often read as a historical phenomenon, yet sociology and anthropology and other knowledge domains, have also studied it. So I said, well, what is economics doing? So I went and did a close hand search of the economic textbooks and found that, in fact, slavery was not addressed in most of these textbooks, going from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations to Paul Samuelson's Principles of Economics to a more current title by Timothy Taylor on Principles of Economics. Textbooks in economics rarely discuss slavery. An important deviation was Eric Williams's classic text, Capitalism and Slavery, but that was written in 1944. That directed our attention to the connectedness of modern economics, the problem of slavery, and economic slavery. These examples appear to present a fact that from chattel slavery to the third slavery, standard economics texts omit the role of slavery in teaching about the production of modern economics. So then I looked and saw Slavery's Capitalism by Beckert and Rockman, which then introduced this notion of a second slavery. And in that way, it seemed to me that we were still not talking about the relationships between contemporary modern day forms of slavery and slavery-like practices, which we are now calling the third slavery or considering as a third slavery. But there were three senses of slavery that I thought were relevant, and I'll just read some quotes. That by 1840, the South grew 60% of the world's cotton and provided 70% of the cotton consumed by the British textile industry. Thus, slavery paid for a substantial share of the capital, iron, and manufactured goods that laid the basis for American economic growth. Slavery was so profitable, it sprouted more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi Valley, River Valley, than anywhere in the nation. With the cash crops of tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane, America's southern states became the economic engine of the burgeoning nation. And nevertheless, slavery was indispensable to European economic development of the New World. It was inconceivable that European colonists could have settled and developed North and South America and the Caribbean without slave labor. And the abolition of slavery affected the economy. Between 1850 and 1880, the market value of slaves falls from just over 100% of GDP. And the former slaves would now be classified as labor, and hence the labor stock would rise dramatically, even on a per capita basis. Either way, abolishing slavery made America a much more productive and hence richer country. And so in the textbooks, the question, a controversy in history textbooks, I suppose is reflected in the controversy of the lack of slavery in economic textbooks. And the failure of those textbooks reflect the failure to reckon with slavery.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and for that close read on the textbooks. I'm sure your average reader would know that unless they were in the field of economics. So it's really helpful to see that. I mean, I would argue too that we don't see this in K through 12 textbooks as much as well. That's one of the other areas where we could see more work on slavery woven into American history and also history of the world. Genevieve, we have you up next for fact number 7. And the fact reads, in 1860, that 4 million enslaved African Americans were worth an estimated $3 billion, more than the combined wealth in railroads, factories, and banks. Pretty heavy one.
Yeah, it's a heavy one. It's a heavy one, and it's also, a really important one, because I think, connecting to what James was saying, it reminds us that the history of capitalist development, banks, railroads, the key things that became the main institutions that facilitated the growth and profitability of the country, were forged through immense suffering and exploitation of people. And that's something, I think, connecting to the points made about teaching. In my field, political science, political economy, the stories we hear about capitalism often leave out that suffering and that violence. It's sort of purified out of the story of how capitalism came to be, which is about free and equal exchange between employers and between workers. And so, seeing this fact, I think for me really resonates, because it shows us that, right from the 1860s, this immense amount of wealth and really the very foundation of the economic system that continues today was forged in this way. I think it's also worth mentioning that, you know, again, we can't make calculations like that today. So we don't know to what extent, you know, the vast wealth that's being generated by corporations, by billionaires, by all sorts of businesses, we just really don't know and can't calculate the extent to which it is also dependent on forms of forced labor. But the studies that have been done indicate that it's also at a very substantial scale, that a lot of the wealth that's generated today also rests on suffering and on violence. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you.
If I may, I think the Center for Social Solutions, we found that I think like $455 billion worth of profit came from forced or forced bonded labor.
And I think like Genevieve was saying, we're going to see that number will probably continue to increase.
Right.
You know, we'll have to edit and revise as we learn more and find and discover more. So
Exactly.
So Lou, fact number 8, an estimated 2.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in North America between 1492 and the 1800s. Can you say something?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think one of the things that resonates about this, I think, is that it helps us understand antebellum slavery, but also continuations of slavery post-emancipation in the context of colonization. And I think that, you know, we see other communities as well, the Mestizo community and the Hispanic Southwest, you know, who might not be actually in that number. But, you know, you tend to see a extractive economy developing with colonial expansion. The amazing maps that some of the friends of the Gilder Lehrman Center have done as far as the expansion of the South into the Southwest of what's now the South. So the frontier of Alabama and Mississippi, the expansion of the American, United States of America into Spanish Florida, all of that, you know, you're talking about a frontier and the replacement of Native American enslaved persons with African American enslaved persons. You know, a lot of the early slavery that was happening around Yale University was shipping Pequot and other natives down to the Barbados and other parts of the British Empire to work and quickly die in the sugar plantations. And when they were exhausted, suddenly Africa beckoned. Now, I think that I actually almost want to turn it on its head and say, let's look at the resistance that ends up happening because of this. Folks saw each other and they saw something of themselves at each other. And that's why there was those pesky realities of alliances being made between Black Americans. They didn't call them that back then, but enslaved Black people in America. And their Native cousins. And you see whether it's people running off, running up to the hills and suddenly calling themselves Portuguese, like the Mulligan or Mugian community in Western North Carolina, or you know, whether it's the kind of sloshing around that you see in New Mexico territory. Those poor congressmen in 1867, when they were trying to come up with that new law that would make it illegal to enslave the Indians or make it illegal to enslave the working class folks in New Mexico, it is amazing how much time they spent trying to figure out, are these people white? Are these people Indians? Are these people mixed? We know they're not Black, but what do we do with this? And I think that to me is one of the reasons why this idea of, you know, the 2.5 million Native Americans enslaved. And I think that it shows the importance of the modern lens, because just as with the African community, you know, we have to be able to take the enslavement, the colonization, and the dispossession of the Native community, and then look at missing and murdered Indigenous women today. We have to look at the dropout rate, or the fact that all of us that are four-year colleges see talented Native American kids, and suddenly they hit their sophomore or junior year and you don't see them again because they're moving home. All of those things are legacies of that slavery and that colonization, just as we have the ongoing legacies of slavery within the African American population. And so I think that, again, to David's point, we can't turn our backs on it because it'll come back and hit us in the face.
Thank you. Well, speaking of David, I want both of you to engage fact number 12. Well, this is about when were enslaved people actually free. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment were not the end of slavery or white supremacy. And as you know, as of yesterday, Juneteenth is another date, June 19, which is tomorrow. We'll celebrate that. But we talk about the ending of slavery. So when were enslaved people actually free? Oh, David, you need to unmute.
I'll start it off, but then I'll let the expert litigator on the 13th Amendment take over. First of all, this is not one of those immutable facts by any means. I mean, it's sort of a truism that slavery didn't end white supremacy. I suppose anyone with one eye open, well, that doesn't mean they'll admit it, but at least they may know that. Now, this is a two-edged sword. The Emancipation Proclamation did end slavery for some people. There's no question about that. There were American slaves in regions of the South where they encountered the Union Army or the Union Navy who were literally legally freed by officers employing the power of Lincoln's executive order in the proclamation. I could name one whose narrative I published, Wallace Turnage, who in Mobile Bay was literally freed by a general using the authority of the proclamation. However, only about 600,000 out of the near 4 million American slaves were legally free at the end of the war. That means, that's one of the reasons that Lincoln and others wanted a constitutional amendment. It means that the vast majority of slaves legally became free after the war was over. But, you know, neo-slavery of various forms, whether in tenant farming or in other kinds of exploitation, of course, took hold in the South in Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. So, you know, it's not the new beginning of a calendar in 1865 because of the 13th Amendment. However, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that Americans had never done anything like this before. The Emancipation Proclamation is the largest confiscation of property in the history of the United States. And the 13th Amendment was the first constitutional amendment, serious one, since the original Bill of Rights. And this was an enactment by a republic ending chattel slavery in the New World. It was a fundamental act brought on by emancipation. No emancipation, no 13th Amendment. No 13th Amendment, no 14th Amendment of equality before law, no 14th and no 15th, and the right to vote. So there's a very mixed story in this. But this notion that somehow, well, slavery wasn't ended is not true, and in the long term, partly true.
Mm-hmm. Great. Lou, would you like to add?
You're the expert litigator.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we see, if you go with, from the litigation standpoint, there's an argument that it's 1944 with Pollock versus Williams, because the Supreme Court finally puts the hammer down on convict leasing and all of those schemes. And man, you can see the pretzels in which, Justice Holmes and everybody else, basically everybody but Justice Harlan, because he was not going to let them off the hook. But, all of them twisting themselves into pretzels in the early 1900s saying, well, this, we certainly wouldn't besmirch the sectionalism of the Southern legislatures. And then 3 times in a row in 10 years, they get these cases come up to the Supreme Court. And even Holmes at some point has to say, these guys aren't about the freedom of contract. They're doing this just as a way to keep enslaving the Black folks. took him 3 tries to get there because he and so many others in the Lochner era court were very much focused on the sanctity of contract. And I think that that's to Duncan's point, as far as innovation, we see so much really active evasion and innovation in both public policy and legislative policy and in legal argument as to all the slippery ways in which systems can be set up in the late 1800s to try to blunt the reality of emancipation. But the reality is that with the passage of the enactment of the 13th Amendment, it is illegal. And even if they're trying to evade it, they're trying to evade something that is in the law. And that evasion doesn't actually survive. It just takes a lot longer to get to fight it back than we needed it to. The other thing that I might say is, as far as this, is that we have to think not just when it perhaps ended, is it an ongoing promissory note, like Dr. King said, it's never cashed because there's insufficient funds. One can also say it's a line of credit that we can keep drawing against and we can use to fight this fight. But if you don't go all the way back to the late 1700s and Jefferson himself and look at the Northwest Ordinance, which is where that language comes in to begin with, Southern representatives to the Confederated Congress before the Constitution, it was the Southerners who voted for that because they thought that all of that northern forest land didn't have any value. And so they were like, if all you Northerners want to have free land up there in Michigan and Minnesota, go for it, because we don't know what to do with those pine trees. And later on, everybody said, well, thank goodness, because that's where the food and that's where the soldiers came from that marched through the South, and they were coming down from free territory. So I think we have to look at, when did it end? One could say that the kernel was with the Northwest Ordinance itself, and it's just taking a long time to ripen.
But
So,
I'm sorry, Donna.
Oh, go ahead. And then we need to move on to the last 2 myths. Last 2 facts before we hear from our audience.
Just that most Americans don't always get this. These were extraordinary acts of federal power, but always in the face of this miserable American tradition of states' rights. That's my point.
No, that's a very good point. That's very important. Genevieve, fact number 15, confronting the many forms of slavery across time and space allows us to see the strategic way the business community has profited by exploiting workers. Can you say a few things about that?
Absolutely. I think it's come up a few times already in the discussion that there are these incredible continuities, both in terms of businesses using slavery or forced labor to make their wealth, also in terms of the people who tend to be subjected to those forms of exploitation. We know that they are people of color, that they're overwhelmingly women, even outside of the sex industry, that today there are high proportions of migrant workers, LGBTQ workers subjected to these forms of exploitation. And so there are these, incredible continuities that go for centuries, both in terms of the economic systems that require slavery, and also the people who tend to be vulnerable to it. And yet we still have these big gaps in understanding the contemporary side of that. As I think Duncan mentioned at the outset, we know we know that it is, I think you said it, the technologies that are used to make money, but we don't know and find it difficult to uncover for obvious reasons, considering much of this is illegal. It's not written down in the same way it was historically, and various other reasons. It's very difficult to study, which businesses tend to use forced labor, how do they make money from it exactly, all the kind of things that you can look up, and this incredible work historians have done to show, these estimates, like in some of the other facts about management practices and economic value of slavery, all of that. And we don't have that same thing today. So I guess what I would say about this fact is that it's very true, and that those of us who study the contemporary side of the equation really have a lot to learn from historians and the work that they've done on business of slavery, supply chains, capitalism, to inform some of the ways that we approach these questions today.
Thank you. So Duncan, we have fact number 19. A number of fundamental US business management practices were developed or refined to manage slave labor, such as asset depreciation and worker productivity. Can you add a little bit to that for us before we hear from our audience? And make sure the audience, I'm going to remind you all to put questions in the Q&A and follow the Center for Social Solutions to keep track of what we're doing on this project and to get involved. Go ahead, Duncan.
Thanks, Dana. I mean, I think, first of all, the fact that it says US management practices, and I think we should just say global management practices, because it would be unfair. But I think, you know, I did a degree in accountancy and an MBA and worked in business for a long time. And those who are on the call who've done those things, MBAs, you know, you have this strange thing where you learn management practices and they start basically some odd reason in 1920 where the scientific management. And the question that always interested me was, well, what happened before 1920? Did we just simply not do business? Mm-hmm. Now, I grew up in the north of England where we had the cotton mills and we had the woolen mills, and regularly as children, we'd see pictures of children in those mills at the turn of the 20th century. And so clearly there were management practices. And if we go back to as Lou was talking about the sugar plantations, we can see that there were real management practices there, rational management, brutal practices about how to manage labor there. You know, Caitlin Rosenthal wrote in her book, I think it's Counting for Slavery, talking about the development of depreciation as a way of looking at how to value human beings on plantations in the South. So these are things that those of us who are in business, who've studied business, just do not think about or talk about, because business management doesn't really deal with business history apart from modern case studies. I mean, we all studied IBM, but did we discuss plantations in the South as they transitioned from the late 50s into the late 60s, trying to figure out how they were going to survive? No, we didn't. And you can see those practices come alive then. My last thing I'd say is that my grandfather was the manager of rubber plantations for the British in the 40s, 50s, and he's long dead now, but he would refer to his employees or the people that were there as coolies for quite an obvious reason. They essentially, as far as I can tell, were probably in some sort of forced labor situation. Now, I don't know what he did, and I hope he tried to do the right thing, but I suspect probably not. And as activists, we focus a lot on Malaysian plantations, and in truth, he would probably be the target if he was alive today. And so we must remember that those practices spread throughout the world. The British took, and this is not anti-British, but the British business people took ideas from Haiti, from sugar plantation in the West Indies, and they took them to Malaysia. You know, they provided accommodation as part of social control. They provided debt in order to keep people inured to the plantations. You know, the company token, all of these things that still exist now. So those people who are listening who are in business, we have to think longitudinally. We have to look back and say, how do we do these things that we do? When we go to HR, when we think about scientific management, productivity, just-in-time manufacturing. Just-in-time works well for hard products and widgets, but it doesn't work quite so easily for things like industrial agriculture. And the surplus that you end up crushing to get to just-in-time supply chains is going to be how people behave. And that takes us back to the 19th century. So I'll finish there.
Thank you. I want to close out our discussion so we can hear from the audience, but I want Lou to say something briefly about fact number 20. Modern slavery operates in a world where holding another in compelled service is illegal because people are rendered vulnerable by factors such as poverty, gender, race, disability, social exclusion, or immigration status.
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the things that we see is that the systems that we've been talking about, of business, of exploitation, of capitalism, all of these things, you know, are setting on top of communities that unfortunately are often the same communities. And that includes powerless and dispossessed white communities, as well as communities of color around the world. But often we're talking about the same groups of people who we see on so many other excluded parts of society. I think that what I want to leave is just the fact that, let's flip that on its head. The solution here is, bonding together, whether it's for worker-driven social responsibility, whether it's for unionization, but changing that power dynamic so that the communities that are affected can actually be on some kind of a level playing field. And I want to thank Earl and Daina and y'all on that put together the panel, because communities have to be involved in solutions. And I don't think that 20 years ago that you'd have a conversation about slavery and you'd end up having Hispanic, Black, Asian, and women scholars and leaders coming together to have this conversation. So hopefully we bring something from our own communities as we're studying this now and as we actually engage on it. So that's my hope as we think about what those systems are. Otherwise, fact number 20 just starts to seem really bleak. And we've got to be able to make change.
Absolutely. So we're going to now open up to the questions and answers that audience members have been submitting. And I'm going to start off with Patrick Rose. He has a question for the panelists. Is it true, as Thomas Piketty has said in his book, Capital, that 2/3 of the wealth in the US through 1860 was connected to economic profits made on slave labor or its future value? If this is true, why isn't this fact discussed in how American wealth was created in colonial America? So I'll let anybody take a stab at that one. Go ahead, David.
Well, first of all, this is discussed.
I was going to say.
I mean, scholars have been writing about this for a long time. So let's clear that up. We got to be careful about reifying some of these percentages and numbers. There are some numbers we know. Slaves were worth about $3 billion in 1860 as an asset. We know that. 2/3 of all American exports were cotton. We know a lot about the power of cotton production as wealth and so on. Whether 2/3 of the entire economy was slave built is one of those elusive facts. What is true is without slavery, the American capitalist system would have been much, much, much weaker. It is impossible to imagine its growth and expansion without slavery. It is impossible to imagine America's banking assets, its maritime trade, its incredible influence on the development of the textile industry, both in Britain and in the Northeast of the United States, without cotton in particular, and without the wealth slavery created. Whether it's exactly 2/3 or a bit less or even a bit more will probably always be debated.
Anyone else want to comment on that? All right, we'll go to the next question. This is from Philip Katz. Is there a 21st fact that any of the panelists would want to add to this list? Oh my gosh, we had what, 90 something when we first started? We had like 99. We whittled it down to 20. So yes, there's plenty more. Does anyone want to share another? I'm trying to remember some of the other ones we had.
Yeah, I've forgotten them too. I have one, but I don't want to. Well, go ahead, Genevieve. You go.
And then James.
Oh no, David, I don't mind. You go ahead.
Well, no.
Okay, I'll go, and then you'll probably maybe you'll have something to say about my fact. I mean, it speaks to one of the other questions that I saw also in the chat, which was about prison labor. I mean, one of the things I would have liked to see in my 21st fact would probably be about prison labor and contemporary forms of forced labor in the United States, because I think one of the things that happens when we do historical contemporary comparisons and kind of discussions that bring history and contemporary together is that we hear a lot about history in the US, and then it becomes, oh, contemporary forced labor, and all the eyes go kind of overseas into these global supply chains. But I think it would be important, and it's really important to acknowledge and to keep in our minds that, you know, there are also contemporary forms of forced labor and slavery in the United States. And prison labor is one of the most long-standing forms of unfree labor that's been used in the US. And importantly, I think it really highlights the role that states play in all of this, you know, because it's not just about big business and it's not just about corporations. It's also about government use of forced labor and of exploited labor. And prison labor is a really very powerful example of that.
James, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Slavery by Another Name is a book that discusses chain gangs and the ways in which African Americans were indiscriminately rounded up and forced to labor, and the difference between chain gang labor and slave labor was the fact that in slavery, the owners had invested in the slaves, and so that they were more or less wanting to maintain the health of the slave. Whereas in chain gangs, the prisoners were acquired free of charge, and they were dispendable. And so we don't know how many men and women were forced into chain gang labor and died.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a horrible aspect of American history.
And there are two scholars, Talitha LaFloria and Sarah Haley, both wrote books about Black women in convict leasing, and really sort of opened the door to understand how that experience was gendered in different ways too. So I do think that's another area that we could add a 21 or 22, 23. There's a lot we can do with that. Absolutely. Lou, you had your hand up. And then David.
Yeah, I think going to this, and thanks both Genevieve and James for teeing this up. You know, I think that one of the things that we have to see is, again, what are our responses, and do we have the power to do something? And if you look at the brick manufacturing in the Atlanta area around the turn of the century, the Chattahoochee brick factory was notorious and very profitable because they'd send the men in to stack and unstack the bricks in the middle of that heated kiln, and they'd end up killing an awful lot of men who they had from the convict leasing schemes. What it ended up doing, if you want to do it just from an economic standpoint, is it totally undercut anybody that was going to do any kind of technology or innovation in the South. But it became such a scandal because it was so horrible that even the Jim Crow South had to do something about it. And the Atlanta City Council made it illegal to buy slave-made bricks. And of course, back then, bricks was also paving stones. And the Chattahoochee Brick Company ended up going out of business. And some enterprising youngsters were able to come in with technology solutions to have a different way to make bricks. We have those same possibilities in front of us right now as far as public procurement is concerned. But that only happens if we, as not just consumers, but voters, start putting pressure on it. If you can get the Georgia legislature and the Atlanta City Council in 1906 or whenever it was, in the middle of Jim Crow, to actually say no more slave-made products, then we should be able to do that in 2021.
Thank you, David. And then we have several other questions. Go ahead, David.
Sorry, speaking of voting, 21st fact, impossible to grasp the American dilemma over voting rights and the fact that states control them without the legacies of slavery. It is all intertwined together. And every time people think about the right to vote, they need to know enough history to link it right back to enslavement and why the spreading of the right to vote from the very beginning in the early 19th century was always butting its head up against this racial slavery system.
Absolutely. So we have a question from an anonymous person that says, in general, do American Blacks whose lineage is slavery feel differently about themselves than do Blacks elsewhere? Or do Blacks who have immigrated to the US from other countries? Yeah, I can't speak for all Black people. But I will say that, I mean, I might be different because my idea about lineage to slavery is I don't take it as a shame. You know, I look at that as I'm proud because of the history, not because that Black people were enslaved, but I'm proud that we survived that. And so I think that's what I bring, and that's why I can do this work that I do, and I can write the books that I write without it bringing me down, although it can be depressing. So I don't know if anybody else has had experience. I know that I have had people from the Caribbean, and I hate being too general about this, but I have had folks from different parts of the Caribbean and also parts of West Africa say, well, you know, we weren't enslaved like you were, or, you know, we didn't experience slavery the same ways. I've heard that, but it hasn't really been, I don't know that it's a common, I don't know if we can group it in terms of what one group would say versus another. I think that's too general, but that's just my thought. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to touch that one. Yes.
I know, I'll go there in a little different way.
Yeah.
I'd have to say that one of the things that in the 1990s, when we were back when this was, the modern stuff was still called involuntary servitude and slavery, before anybody started calling it trafficking. The folks that were very enthusiastic about working on these cases, which by then had become cases involving Central Americans, South Americans, Filipinos, and others, more so than the cases in the 70s and early 80s, where it was still Black folks, whether as domestic servants or in the fields. Our best allies, whether in law enforcement or in the assistant U.S. attorneys, et cetera, for those cases involving the immigrants, were Black prosecutors, Black cops, you know, et cetera. And there was always that moment. I don't want to, overstate this or dishonor a confidence, but there was always that moment, 3 or 4 months into working on the case where, you'd be driving somewhere and then suddenly that conversation would happen as far as why I'm working so hard on this case and why being able to do a slavery case for these people means so much to me. And I was lucky to be colleagues with folks who trusted me to say that to. But what more can you do? You can't go back and stand up for your great-great-grandparents, but you might be able to stand up for those Mayan workers out in the fields, or that West African girl that's being held as a domestic servant.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
If I may, I do not speak for all American Blacks either, but the one thing that I think in the fact needs to be acknowledged that there were more slaves taken from Africa and brought to Brazil than were to the United States, and that you had enslaved people throughout the new, quote unquote, new world, who each have a historical experience that is different based upon who the enslavers were and the kinds of labor that they were forced to do. And so those stories are still coming out. There's incredible research that I've seen on slavery in Brazil. And obviously those people who were enslaved in the Caribbean have a different experience based upon the way in which religion played a role in the way in which Africans were viewed as more or less human or not. And so the way in which people feel in part might be a reflection on the way in which they were treated.
Absolutely. So we have several questions. I'm going to throw out a few of them right now and sort of do a round robin, and you guys can tackle which ones you want because we're running out of time. But here's one for Genevieve about fact number 7. To Genevieve's point, fact number 7, how much of international trade involves forced labor? I'm thinking of all the sailors working on ships who were forced into shipping and were not allowed off ships. So that's one. I'm going to read another one and you guys can think about this. From Zarina Akili, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I apologize if I butchered your name. Is there a legal case for reparations for African Americans? If so, what forms might it take? If not, what might be the legal cases against reparations for African American slavery? And I'm going to read one more, and then we'll sort of do a round robin here. Neha Misara says, I think that there's a lot of issues with the term quote unquote modern slavery to describe forced labor and other forms of human trafficking. I work extensively on forced labor issues, and I didn't think that people, that people don't want to address indicators of forced labor, and they don't see such indicators as slavery, which then leads to minimizing of the extreme form of exploitation. What are your thoughts? I didn't find that people, sorry. So these are 3 different questions. Genevieve, would you like to talk about that first one about international trade?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for all the great questions. I think the first thing to say about this is it's an incredibly important question, and the honest answer is that we don't know how much trade depends on slavery today. We know that it's a lot, so I think it's really indicative that every study that's been done of looking at forced labor in different sectors, from garments to cocoa to shipping to footwear to tea, you could pick kind of any product really, and when people go out and they research these products, they always find some form of forced labor or bonded labor or slavery, and oftentimes it's not a little bit. So there's been this idea in the contemporary circles that forced labor is kind of the thing that happens when someone's unlucky or there's a bad apple criminal employer or something. But a study I did of the tea industry, close to 1,200 workers were involved in my study of tea and cocoa, and every single one of them reported some form of forced labor indicator. And so, we know that it's very widespread, and we know it's very widespread across many, many, many different types of products. But what we don't know, I would say rigorously, just because we're just really starting to look at this seriously, is to estimate prevalence or profit or economic value in any meaningful way. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Great. Before we turn to reparations, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes with Dr. Cruz, can one of you want to respond to this question about the term modern slavery and whether or not it's a useful term? Go ahead, Duncan, and then Lou. Go ahead, Duncan.
Thanks, Dana. I mean, Nia, we've come across each other. I'm completely with you. I think modern slavery has been distracting, and I think there was to the point about what people, from my perspective, people should take home after this discussion is beware of recency bias. We are easily convinced by what's happened to us in our lives most recently, and so in relation to this topic, modern slavery is the most recent iteration, and there's a lot of discussion around that, but I think people have to look back and they have to look about what actions were taken for what ends, and the ends were profit and income, and the actions were some forms of exploitation and abuse, which have moved on. And so I'm completely with you and in agreement is that there's been a confusion by the introduction of modern slavery as a concept through the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, for its various reasons. And I think Emily Kenway has written a book on that, which is interesting. And it's detracted away from what actually is happening, what techniques and mechanisms are used to abuse people and gain profit from their labor. And we have to get people to think to the more fundamentals rather than the latest kind of description or unit of measurement that social scientists have become somewhat obsessed with. I do think the number of people and the amount of profit is irrelevant to looking at the underlying systems and thinking of these things as systemic. Certainly in my work, when I was working and looking at things like anti-money laundering, insider dealing, you didn't count every dollar that was being laundered and studying. You thought systemically, can someone do it? And if they can, how do we stop that? And can we put some of those people in prison at the same time? It wasn't a question of how many of the billions of dollars happen to be tainted through money laundering. It is not particularly a useful number to know. And I think we've got obsessed by units of measurement in this.
Yeah, we were stuck in that with slave trade literature early on about the numbers of people that came over that were forcibly removed, the numbers game debate. Lou, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think that, Duncan and I both agree and disagree on this one. And I think that some of it is, where do you set your beginning point or your start? So if you set your start with 2000, which is when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Palermo Protocol in the UN come online, then modern slavery is some new thing that gets done since then and is a challenge to that. If you set your standpoint anywhere before the fall of 2000, trafficking is a new thing that came in and renamed slavery. And so which one is it? Is modern slavery simply returning us to what we called it before the fall of 2000? Or did the word trafficking end up giving us any useful thing in addressing this? And there's, I think, arguments back and forth as to what was useful about the fall of 2000 and what wasn't. For me as a lawyer, a lot of it comes down to what legal tools get opened up. I would suggest, based on working with the people and being part of a lot of the discussions, that the European Court of Human Rights would not have ruled the way that it has over the last 20 years in a series of cases that increase victim protections and hold states accountable if it was basing this on something called forced labor or something called human trafficking, as opposed to being able to and being forced to ground this in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which makes slavery illegal. You also, I think, see that notion of slavery as a jus cogens international law norm that's out there, that's available to us. Finally, I'd say, just from a political standpoint, whether it's the British or others, it is a non-starter in the US Congress to come in with new regulations and new labor laws. But if you come in with something that they think is an anti-slavery or an anti-trafficking law, you can actually pocket some wins. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should accept that, and conceptually that we should float down to the level of the people who might otherwise block things. But I think that we've certainly seen over the years that if, as soon as you take the slavery lens away, this diverts back into a security analysis by states. It does not divert into the labor rights analysis that we would like if you stop using the word slavery.
Thank you. So listen, we have about a few more minutes, and I wanted to see if we can talk about actionable takeaways. So we're now aware, we have some facts, we're bringing awareness to these issues, but if you all could just say maybe a 30-second soundbite of an actionable takeaway that we can think about as we move forward with this new knowledge about these facts. I'll start with you, David.
Okay. I think historians need to create a war room to fight back in the political realm against the current crusade to tell us what to teach about slavery. And secondly, there are models of reparations, to that questioner. There are legal models. They're sometimes called the tort model. There's a wealth gap model, but all talk about reparation needs to be rooted in understanding of other systems that have tried it. Reparation is too often simply wish fulfillment without understanding what's politically possible, legally possible, and morally possible in our own environment. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should do it. But
okay, Duncan. We're now aware of some of these issues. What kind of actionable takeaways can you share with the audience?
I think everybody should first of all consider that they're part of the fight. There is no activists or others who are sort of the audience. whatever most jobs that you will be doing will have come about because of what has happened in, the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And so think of yourself very much as in this, and think about, the practices that you have and how you do those and what they add up to in terms of providing protection, providing prevention, but also where they end up profiting from other people's abuse and misery. And I think that's the sort of the basic message that I would say is that don't think of yourself as separated from this. Think of yourself as very much in it.
Thank you. Genevieve, takeaways.
Takeaways. People who are interested in forced labor today, I think, need to learn from the past, need to read the history of it, need to understand the continuities and discontinuities. And I think everybody who is involved in this struggle should talk about it as a systemic problem, looking at the business structures, looking at capitalism, looking at, the supply chain structures, not shying away from seeing this as something that is really a key part of the economy that will require systems level change to address.
Thank you. James.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll join David in the historian's war room because I do think that the textbook industry needs to be confronted. And there's something that I think everyone should be aware of. It's kind of this oppression of ignorance that we're allowing people who don't know to oppress scholars, intellectuals, and writers, as well as laymen and young learners.
Thank you. Lou, quickly, any takeaways? I want to introduce one other panelist after you finish.
Yep. So I think 4 takeaways: be mad about both exploitation and about evasion. Express joy, live the freedom because they can't stop you when you're living your freedom. Vote and eat Tony's chocolate only chocolate because they didn't go to the Supreme Court yesterday like Cargill and Nestle did to be able to not be held responsible for what they're doing to children in cocoa plantations. So they should get rewarded for not having done that. Tony's chocolate only. It's really good chocolate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to introduce Dr. Jessica Cruz. She's the managing director of the Center's Mellon Foundation grant, Crafting Democratic Futures. And she's part of the Just Futures initiative. In this role, Dr. Cruz oversees all operations at both the University of Michigan Hub, as well as the 9 institutional partners scattered across the nation. The project seeks to develop reparation solutions driven by institution community collaborations. Dr. Cruz, can you say a few words for us?
Absolutely. And first, I just want to say bonjour, buenas tardes, and good afternoon, everyone. And also, gracias, miigwech, and thank you for having me today. I appreciate being here with you to acknowledge Juneteenth and also to be a part of this discussion on the historical and also complex contemporary notions of slavery. So thank you. And as has already been mentioned, our center, the Center for Social Solutions, received a $5 million grant from the Just Futures initiative from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. It's an initiative for us called Crafting Democratic Futures, situating colleges and universities in community-based reparation solutions. Dr. Earl Lewis is our leading PI, principal investigator, and we have several partnering teams across the country, which kind of give us an opportunity to impact change along different regions of the country. One, the central north region part of the country, across the Midwest, but then also along the Eastern Seaboard. Each one of them will have a particular project, but we have a focus, I would say, on African-American, but also Native and Indigenous communities in the country. I'll share more about the teams in a moment. But to kind of tie in to something that was brought on earlier in terms of examples of reparations programs, I wanted to bring some attention to Evanston, Illinois, because Evanston recently became the first in the country to implement a community-based local reparations program. In fact, it was just this past March, earlier in the year. And for the story with them is that through very careful historical research and community engaged conversations, they just kind of came to understand that social policy meant that Black and Brown communities, of course, paid an exceptional price for the war on drugs with higher than anticipated incarceration rates. And so what they decided to do was to use tax funds, 3% of actual sales tax on the legalization of marijuana, to underwrite investment in and financial resources for its Black residents. So they did a pledge, and the pledge is to distribute $10 million over the next 10 years. And as I mentioned in March, they voted to distribute $400,000 to eligible households. For this, people had to be qualifying residents that either had lived in or been a direct descendant of a Black person who had lived in Evanston between 1919 and 1969 and had suffered discrimination in housing due to the city ordinances, policies, or practices. And so in that way, Evanston became the first in the country to pay reparations to its Black residents. So this is a first step. Some folks call it a down payment. It's not a final project. It's not a perfect product, but it is a work in progress. And there's some debate that goes on about what actually constitutes reparations. Some say this is more of a housing voucher, et cetera. But this is tied to a specific time period, a specific policy, a harm that was done, and then an effort funded by the local government there, the city council, to repair the harm that was done. So with that in mind, I just want to say we believe this model is replicable, is scalable. And so this is an example of the work that we're doing. So as I mentioned, we have several partners across the country. I'll go through very quickly here, so I know we're short on time, and list some of the partners and just highlight two of them that I think give us an idea of the work that we're doing. So the list is 1, Spelman College, 2, Carnegie Mellon University, 3, Emory University, 4, Rutgers University, New York and New Jersey. And then we're also partnering with the Council of Independent Colleges. And from that, there are 4 additional colleges. So 1 is Connecticut College, 2 is Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and then of course us, the University of Michigan. So I want to highlight a couple of different things here. 1, in Spelman College, led by, in that case, Dr. Cynthia Spence from their social justice program, said they're focused on, for the most part, the Port Wentworth area of the Savannah area in Georgia. And they are actually collaborating with the reparations project. So pulled directly from their website, it reads like this. The Reparations Project is a multifaceted redress initiative created by the Quarterman and Keller Fund. It's a fund that seeks to narrow the wealth gap and promote equity by centering descendants of those that were enslaved and supporting descendants of the families of enslavers to pursue ancestral healing through the repair of generational harm. And so the project is focused on 3 areas: education for African Americans, legal land redress, and the amplification of descendant voices. I like that example because it's a story of 2 families that are coming together and doing this work. I also want to highlight the work of Concordia College. And I want to highlight them because in their area, which is led, by the way, by Dr. James Postuma, they're focusing on really addressing the intergenerational trauma that has been caused by forced Indian boarding school experiences. And as an extension of that, language learning as reparations. So again, I mentioned earlier that for the most part, our projects tend to be focused on African American, Black communities or Native Indigenous communities. But I do want to mention that each team is comprised of not only faculty, but community fellows. And the community fellows help the universities or colleges form community-based partnerships in their select regions to have these issues really come to bear. And these issues will be framed, identified, et cetera, by their local community. So the community voice is really important. The partnerships become key. With that, I also want to point out, as I mentioned earlier, that some of this will be a debate, right? We want to create a framework. We've said that sometimes there's a debate about what actually constitutes reparations. And so I want to mention, of course, the framework developed by Professor William Darity, who uses the ARC framework, acknowledgement, restitution, and closure. And they believe the federal government is the only entity that can truly implement reparations. But we believe that it's not an either or, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. We can push this as well. And indeed, much of the work that has come about in the federal government has come from localized work across the country. I also want to mention WQED, which is our public media partner. And so these projects that are happening across the country will come about a bit thematically. So for example, there are a couple of different teams that are focused on education. Others are focused on land dispossession, et cetera. And so we'll highlight these themes in partnership with WQED. Daryl Ford Williams specifically is leading an effort to create a public documentary that will really highlight these themes and push forward a national conversation around reparations, chronicle the process, and share recommendations that we may learn along the way. And so with that, I just want to again emphasize that we truly do believe that this is indeed a model that is defined by partnerships between colleges and universities, but with key focus on community-based organizations, that it is replicable, that it is scalable, and that it is sustainable. And so we invite all of you to consider how your institutional partnerships could create similar projects to continue moving the work forward. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. This is wonderful. What a great example of an actionable takeaway. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope that you all get involved. To learn more, please follow at Solutions. That's the Twitter account for the University of Michigan's Center for Social Solutions. I want to thank our panelists, the participants, and our sponsors, with a special thanks to the University of Michigan Women of Color Task Force. And if for those that had questions that we did not answer, Dr. Trotter, I apologize, we didn't get to your question. There's also Dr. Amani Jackson will be writing their responses to those questions at the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions Twitter page. So please, once again, thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for being here today.